So, Industria is finally out. Well, by the time I got to finish this video, it has been out for a while now. You can thank my daytime job for that. But yeah, I've been waiting anxiously for this narrative-driven first-person shooter to come out, and even featured it in my first episode of my Games to Look Out For series. That demo I played back then left me with a very good first impression of the game, and I just couldn't wait to see how the full version holds up. But it's here now, I played through it, so let's see how it shaped up. First thing that struck me when I saw the first promo shots of Industria was how amazingly good the graphics were for what is basically an indie production, as they are almost on the level of a AAA game. But when I say graphics, I'm not just talking about the graphical fidelity here, but the art direction as well. And it's in that department where I feel you immediately notice you are actually dealing with an indie studio here, because it all looks so wonderful and unique, in the sense that I feel lately only indie studios really possess this sensitivity to aesthetic in order to be able to create such unique and beautiful worlds. I mean, if you look into the past, there have been many AAA games that had a unique aesthetic similar to what we see here. But when was the last time you saw one of those? For me, I'd say it's the BioShock series, but I can't remember if any games came out in recent times that had an equally unique setting like that. Maybe Control? But still, that's one such game in a sea of AAA titles. So, in that regard, it's really nice to see a game like Industria, which brings back that unique vibe that games could have back in the day. Titles such as Half-Life 2, Portal 2, BioShock, and yes, even Control somewhat. And I even said as much in my first Games to Look Out For video, where I compared Industria's visual style to these types of games. Especially when it comes to Half-Life 2, owed in no small part to its Viktor Antonov inspired design that influences their distinctly European looking cityscape, blanketed by this weird out-of-place technology. Portal 2's influences, on the other hand, can be seen in the Atlas building you visit early on in the game, whose halls to me were very reminiscent of the old abandoned Aperture time capsules you visit later on in that game. BioShock's influence then is reflected in the combination of the Victorian-looking environments combined with the strange devices and contraptions you find littered around that seem out of place and time when compared with set environments. There is also, of course, its chunky-looking shotgun that passes more than a superficial resemblance to that of the first BioShock game. And finally, Control. Because in the game, you'll have these dreamlike sections between levels that sees you exploring these expansively large, unnaturally so even, Brutalist libraries which are quite reminiscent of the oldest house, the immense shape-shifting Brutalist office complex that features in Remedy's Control. But now that I finally got to experience the full game, I kinda feel bad for lazily comparing the game to those classics, because sure, while the game does remind me of all those games at times, is it because the developers wanted to emulate those games' style? Or maybe it's just that us, the fans, we're just really desperate to see games like these come out again, and therefore we resorted to direct comparisons to these types of games just because we miss them so dearly. And while some of these games might actually have been influences on the game's designers, like for example Half-Life 2, others like Control and Portal 2 might just be more of a case of circumstances really. Take the library sections for instance. I said before that these structures reminded me quite of the game Control, and I wouldn't exactly be wrong to assume so, as both employ the same Brutalist style architecture in their environments. But seeing as the developers are from Germany, Brutalist architecture is actually pretty close to home for them. So, it's more likely that they were inspired by what they saw in their everyday life, rather than having been influenced by a game like Control. After all, It's not that Remedy invented brutalism. And you could extend that to the other influences as well, because everything in this game just looks very distinctly European. So in that regard, it does make sense for them to create a game with this type of aesthetic. But overall, I have to say that Industria is more than its influences, more than the sum of its parts. It's not Half-Life 2, nor is it BioShock or any of the other games I mentioned. This game is very much Industria at the end of the day. And Industria just happens to be a gorgeous looking game with an excellent sense of art direction. It is so beautiful and unique in fact, that if you were to take out the enemy AI out of the game entirely, it'd almost feel like you'd just be playing a really cool walking simulator. Such is its gorgeous sense of aesthetic. The only downside to all this beauty though is one that shouldn't come as a complete surprise when it comes to a small indie studio developing a game of this caliber. Like I said before, the game is gorgeous, but for such a small team to make such a good looking game? Well, concessions will have to be made in certain places, and this is something that gets rather obvious in certain parts of the game that feel rather barren when you compare them to other areas. The most obvious offender here being the town hall area, because seeing how gorgeous some of the previous areas were, it is kind of egregious to see how barren a place like the town hall of all places looks. Out of anything, you'd expect this place to look simply stunning, as it is supposed to be the center point and crown jewel of the city. Now, I get that this place is supposed to look abandoned, but it doesn't even look lived in. More like they built it and just ceased production halfway. If it being abandoned is what it's supposed to look like, then they should have at least made an attempt to make it look more lived in, but as it stands now, it just looks empty and barren. This of course is not an attempt to slam the developers, because I will say it again, with such a small team behind this game, I think it's totally understandable that they simply couldn't allocate more time to certain areas. But from an aesthetic standpoint, I do find it to be a bit of a missed opportunity, especially when it comes to the town hall, which I expected to be the visual culmination of all the beautiful architecture that I saw mere minutes before. But despite the game having a beautiful art direction, the game is still a first-person shooter at heart. And seeing as a first-person shooter just wouldn't work without something to, well, shoot at, the game is gonna need some cannon fodder. And that role here is filled perfectly by this army of robot adversaries under control of the Atlas Artificial Intelligence that decided, as is par for the course for an artificial intelligence, that we humans are inferior to machine and do not really deserve to live on this planet. But seeing as shipping our asses to the nearest Goldilocks system seemed a bit cumbersome, she just opted for the send a robot army to eliminate the inferior fuckers direction. But more on the story later. As for now, we focus on the machine army that the developers at Bleakmill created here, as I think they did a great job offering a small yet mechanically diverse lineup of enemy types here. Our first enemy type we encounter is the most common in the game, but I feel also the most iconic one. The first time you encounter these guys, you'll find them in a harmless yet foreboding standby mode, just standing there. An utterly lifeless hulk, but an ominous presence nonetheless. Looking like a merely functional cage, made to vaguely emulate the human shape, filled with visible wires connecting all their inner workings, these guys look like they were just haphazardly being slapped together, like a hastily improvised prototype. And this definitely helps them in their intimidating look, especially with the girth that their chassis requires to stow away all that thrown together hardware. And the funny thing is that it probably took a great deal of effort and a good eye for design from the designers to actually make them look that hastily thrown together. These guys also have this big ass orange LED on what's supposed to be an approximation of their head. And I can tell you right now that if you encounter one of these in a dark hallway, you will shit your pants. The faint light they emit looks plain ominous in a dark environment, especially with how it accentuates their threatening, slumped silhouette against the rest of the background. This guy to me is easily the star of the show here. But other than this old rusty boy, we also have this small robot whose only function it is to charge at you and then very rudely explode in your face upon impact. And also this more advanced android-looking robot. This more advanced unit is a lot more mobile, and some variations of them can even open fire on you, making them more of a threat to your general health. If you hypothetically were to have these robots stood all next to each other on a police lineup for crimes committed against humanity, you'd notice that this is a bit of a weird mix of robots, stylistically speaking. But upon closer inspection, you can see a sort of evolution throughout a bunch of them. Kinda like the first model was merely a first tryout, and then you see the more sleek Android model, which looks way more advanced and refined in comparison. It's kind of like the Atlas AI has been gradually improving upon their design over time. And I think that's kinda cool and probably something the devs purposely did for lore reasons. And if they did, I have to applaud them because that's some subtle but very cool piece of world building right there. A game soundtrack at the base level should provide something for your ear to register besides just the game's ambient sounds. A good soundtrack manages to capture the game's vibe in its music. A great soundtrack, on the other hand, elevates the game's vibe and builds further on what the developers already established. It becomes a soundtrack that becomes inseparable from the game itself. Turn off the music in the settings menu, and you can just feel you're missing something. Something essential. It just feels off without it. And such a soundtrack is that of Industria. It all starts with a jazzy yet haunting reverb-ridden saxophone that graces the main menu, which sounds like it's being transmitted from another dimension or something. And this immediately also establishes the mysterious "what in the hell is going on here" tone of the game really well. And it's this atmospheric tone that's being set here that runs throughout the whole game, but manages to adapt style whenever needed for the required mood. And seeing as the game has quite some moods going on, evidently, so does the soundtrack have styles to alternate between. It can range from moody to melancholic, from synth-based to acoustic guitar-driven. To even downright threatening, as evidenced by the claustrophobic drone that accompanies one of the apartment hallway sections. The dark, poorly lit hallways of said apartments are infested with the aforementioned cage robots that ominously lie in wait in their slumped sleep mode, waiting for your proximity to activate themselves. There's nothing but the faint light of their LED to give away the slightest presence of their threatening silhouette. And combined with this music, it just turns the game into a horror game for a moment. This, of course, is just one example of how No Bloom Now's soundtrack enriches the game. But it does so for the whole game. It always perfectly captures the mood or emotion that is needed for the level, or, dare I even say it, needed for the scene. I'm not saying this to sound pretentious or anything, but some parts of the game really feel like a scene as opposed to just a level. The game itself even refers to them as such, so maybe this is just me being subconsciously influenced by their naming convention, but it does really feel like that at times, with how each scene ends a narrative thread and then carries on to the next. These aren't merely objectives to complete, but story beats. And the music? It's just a perfect accompaniment to these scenes and manages to serve the right mood for the emotions they are supposed to conjure. So, the story. I haven't gone into this much yet, but it's easily the second reason this game sets itself apart from most other first-person shooters, besides the gorgeous and unique art design it has. Because for a simple first-person shooter, it has a really involved and interesting story that focuses not just on the world building, but also focuses on the characters therein and their lives and motivations.
When Atlas came and Hakovic was evacuated, I was wounded and treated in the city center hospital. I was left behind.
Brent, I'm so sorry.
Industria tells the story of Nora Solheim, a young German woman having her life thrown upside down on the night that the Berlin Wall fell. And while I'm sure that certain event threw many a life upside down, many maybe not so extremely as in fictional Nora's case here. Because after getting a worrying call from Walter, her boyfriend and head of the Atlas project, in the research center they both work at, she heads to the research center herself in search of him. When arriving there, she finds the office in quite a state of disarray, as the Stasi had already arrived there to rid the offices of any trace of the groundbreaking work that was being done there. Furthermore, the building appears to be shaking on its grounds, as wave after wave of some sort of quake hits. As she arrives at the center of the Atlas unit, she discovers that Walter has done it.
You did it. You brilliant idiot.
And whatever it is that he has done, she follows suit and soon after finds herself in what seems to be a parallel dimension.
Where am I? What is this place?
In search of Walter, she explores this parallel version of Berlin called Hakavik, that resembles the Europe of old somewhat and is seemingly completely abandoned. Abandoned save for Brent apparently, the old chap that saved you in that first encounter you had with the robots. After giving you some well-meaning advice, he rolls away into the sunset, but soon after finding a radio device, you'll be able to maintain contact with him. This basically gives you a Russell-like companion to accompany you throughout the game. Nora in herself is already an interesting and strong enough character to carry the game herself, but it's the interplay between these two that makes it so interesting. It offers some relief to the player as well, as their conversations are a nice and comforting thing to have between all the combat sections. It just makes for a nice cool-down moment in between these sections. The presence of Brent also makes for a natural vessel to expose you to Hakavik's history, as well as an interesting way for the game's backstory to be told without having to rely on notes being strewn across the levels. After all, the use of notes in games is a more detached way of relaying the world's backstory to the player. I mean, there will be plenty of those to be found across the levels, but it's nice that it's not a sole method that they employ to tell you this story. These notes are more optional bits of backstory anyway. They're nice to have, but you won't miss any essential bits by skipping them. The most important bits will always be relayed to you through Nora and Brent's interactions. The story here isn't flat and straight either. It goes through quite a bit of twists and turns that will make it so that you'll keep your focus on the narrative at all times. It ensures that the story in this game is front and center at all times and more than just an excuse for blasting robo-dudes in the face. It feels like the storyline wasn't written merely in service of the gameplay, but that it was equally as important to the developer's vision of Hakavik. It doesn't just feel tacked on, but as a part of the whole experience. But, story and vibe aside, a first-person shooter first and foremost should have gunplay that just feels good. And boy, does it ever feel good here. And that is in no small part to just how fun it is to take the enemies down, especially the more clunky cage chassis robots. They just fall down in the most satisfactory clanky sounding way, emitting sparks everywhere, while a satisfying low-end shutdown sound emits from their steel bodies. The way this game plays is through the familiar aim-down sight system, popularized by the Call of Duty series. But while aim-down sights is an option and one you'll need in certain situations, I appreciate that the game doesn't rely on it all the time. It is mostly handy in situations where you have enemies firing back at you while keeping their position. But thanks to the game's diversity in enemy behavior, it makes it so that the game at times can feel more akin to a boomer shooter when you're dealing with enemies that come charging at you. This is honestly where the game is at its best too, as the aim down sights option can be rather spotty at times. While it mostly works well, I've noticed that when enemies are situated too far away, the shots don't seem to register at all. This is especially noticeable with the sniper rifle, where I am convinced that I have a sure shot lined up, but because of the enemy's far away distance, it doesn't seem to register at all. But despite that little gripe, it overall works pretty much like you'd expect it to, even though it's nothing particularly earth-shattering. But, like I said before, the parts where you're up close with the enemies are the best and most rewarding feeling parts of the game anyway, and are luckily the most prominent of the game. But the option is there and makes for a first-person shooter that offers quite a bit of variety combat-wise. And that variety isn't just limited to combat scenarios, as I feel that the game as a whole offers a lot of variety gameplay-wise as well. This makes it so that the game easily keeps your attention thanks to the variety that's on offer here, and that makes for a well-paced experience overall. It's not just combat scenarios all the time, but it also offers segments ranging from claustrophobic hallways that keep you on your toes and have a tense horror-like vibe, to more serene walking sim-like exploratory sections offering you reprieve and the time to breathe while you take in the gorgeous environments. One thing I wish they'd have used more of though is more puzzles to spice up the gameplay, especially as the beginning of the game offers quite a few, and I really love these as they just offer that bit of extra variety to the gameplay. Which is why I find it sad to see that the ratio of puzzles to combat and exploration kinda diminishes in the latter part of the game, as I really like them. It just feels like they kind of forgotten about them, or just didn't have any time left to program them in before their deadline. I don't know. But of course, all these gameplay elements are going to need to have some good levels to be set in. And the level design here has a really nice flow to it, where it doesn't just feel like a set of separate levels, but more like a journey towards your goal set with obstacles for you to overcome. In that regard, it really feels quite a bit like Half-Life 2 in its setup. Especially with the train journey that you have to undertake, which reminds me quite a bit of Water Hazard, where it has you traveling towards a set destination, but sees you having to leave the comfort of your vehicle in order to overcome this obstacle that's blocking it from progressing further. Luckily though, this section only sees you doing this once, and is a hell of a lot more fun and well paced than Water Hazard ever was. And an especially cool thing about these levels feeling like a seamless progression is that you will always have points of reference in the landscape, where at times you can actually recognize parts of the city in the distance that you were just traversing a couple of minutes ago. This really makes the world feel seamless, well realized and grounded. When you start up a new game, you are greeted with two difficulty options: normal and hardcore. As per usual for a new game, I started it on normal difficulty, because I'm far from a hardcore gamer, even though I do have quite some experience with first-person shooters. That said though, I finished the game without dying once and never really felt challenged. I was never without ammo for my weapons or in a pinch when it came to health, because the game offers plenty of pickups along the way. Maybe too plenty actually. And I find that to be a shame really, because there's this sense of survival instinct that kicks in just from even hearing the sounds of a robot booting up. Because yeah, haven't you heard? Robots are fucking scary now. Just listen to those boot up sounds. They're plain menacing, aren't they? But sadly, this feeling of terror it elicits isn't being reflected in the game's difficulty. You're never left to scramble for ammo or health in a fight. In fact, you always feel pretty safe, which is in stark contrast to the sometimes oppressive ambience that they managed to create that does a really good job of making the robots feel like a genuine threat. But it just doesn't translate to the game's difficulty, as I'd honestly call normal more easy than normal really. And hardcore on the other hand actually feels more akin to what is supposed to be a normal mode. Not that there's a huge difference between the two modes, but after a while I did get the impression that enemies had a bit more hit points allocated to them, and that their hits do take more life out of your health pool. The biggest, most noticeable difference it offers though is that saving is now exclusively done manually through the typewriters that you find throughout the environments. In normal mode, these were basically just set dressing, as they had no meaningful function there, as the game was littered with generous autosaves. These are however not present in hardcore mode, and it's this that does create quite a bit of tension in the game, as a death would mean you would be reverted to your last manual save, which could mean a reasonable setback, as these typewriters aren't exactly plentiful. But even though I like the tension that this mechanic brought to the game, again, at no time did I die during my test run of the hardcore mode. Granted, I only tested it until the streets level, which is about halfway through the game. But seeing as this section has the game's most intense encounter, I don't exactly expect the rest of the game to offer that much more of a challenge. But take that with a grain of salt until I actually do finish my hardcore playthrough though. But all in all, I have to say that the easiness of the game did not hurt the overall experience for me, as the game offers more than just combat encounters anyway. It was the story and vibe that got me hooked, and despite not being that challenging, I did have a lot of fun dismantling these robot enemies anyway, because the combat here is just so fun and engaging, despite it offering little challenge. So overall, I think Industria is a really good game, and if anything here appealed to you at all, or if you're a fan of Valve's games or other atmospheric shooters, then you definitely owe it to yourself to check it out for all the reasons I discussed here. But I couldn't in good conscience just leave you here without some very much needed buyer beware info. The first, and I feel most important, is that the technical side of the game isn't quite on point yet. But I mean, what did you expect? A gorgeous looking game made by a team of 6 members at its most that started as a hobby project? Yeah, it's gonna have some imperfections here and there. Luckily, most of these are mostly just graphical glitches and not of a game-breaking nature. Things like visible seams that look like gaps between surfaces and a blue fog when you set the shadows too low, for instance. So, all in all, not that bad, right? Well, that's because I ran the game in DirectX 11. When I tried to run it in DirectX 12, it was buggy as all hell, to the point of crashing even. So, little tip, if you encounter crashes frequently while using the DX12 API, it's better that you revert to the DX11 one until these bugs have been patched out. But the guys at Bleakmill aren't a bunch of lazy boys and are already hard at work on future patches as we speak in order to make it run as it was supposed to. So, with a little luck, these complaints will be history by the time you're watching this video. The second point is that Industria is a rather short game, as it runs for about 4 hours. And that has already caused quite a bit of controversy among gamers who are expecting a longer AAA-like experience. And I find it kinda hard to say either, well, it's too short, or, well, you have to understand it from the developer's point of view. The thing is, I do understand why the developers didn't make it longer. But I can't lie to myself, I played it and I just wanted more. Not because I feel like the developers robbed me of content, but because I genuinely liked what I played and just wanted more of it. I wanted to submerge myself into this lovingly crafted world and narrative for just a while longer, because Bleakmill managed to make me fall head over heels in love with the world and story they created here. So while it is really short, I can attest to it also being quite sweet. But if it's any consolation, Industria is supposed to be part 1 of a 3-part series, as it turned out midway through development that the scope of the game was a bit too big for a mere indie team. So instead of one huge game that might have never have come out anyway, they decided to split it up in 3 parts. And I really do hope to see them all release one day, as there are a lot of questions still lingering after having finished the game. And it's okay to have some unanswered mystery lingering after a story is wrapped up, but here I feel like there are things in the story that were meant to be expanded upon. And to be quite honest, I just wouldn't mind more story set in this world, as I found it to be a very intriguing one. So, with that said, I can only say, if this game piqued your interest in any way, please consider buying this game so that we at least have an increased chance of seeing the other installments release someday. It's hard enough to be an indie, but to be an indie with such lofty ambitions as Bleakmill, as to even want to compete with AAA games ambitions-wise, seems like an exceptionally imposing task. So if you like what you see here, please consider supporting this brave studio and hopefully opening the way for more studios with ambitious ideas such as these to take a shot at it, so we can hopefully see more indie games take on the AAA industry in the single-player story-driven game space. So, that's it for me then. But remember, if you like my content, then please subscribe to the channel for future content and don't forget to give the video a like. And if you want to support the channel in growing further, then please consider donating to my Patreon for early access to my videos, lots of extra content, access to the Discord channel, and having your name appear in the credits right here. But if you don't want to be chained down by a subscription model, then you can always donate just the one time on my Ko-fi, both of which are linked right down there in the description. Well, thank you so much for watching and see you all next time.